Hello, thanks for tuning in. This is an introduction to the geography, culture, and history of Europe. So Europe and Russia have several distinct regions. So we're going to start kind of to the west, we're going to move east, and then back south, and then east again. So farthest to the west is the Iberian Peninsula, and this is primarily highlands. When you go north out of the Iberian Peninsula, you run into the Pyrenees Mountains, which divide the Iberian Peninsula from the rest of Europe. North of the Iberian Peninsula are the British Isles, home of Ireland, England, Scotland, and Wales. No, the other Wales, the land that's part of Great Britain. To the east is the Northern European Plain, or the Great European Plain, although I don't know how something can be great and plain at the same time. Something that is plain doesn't sound that great if you ask me. But anyway, the Great Plain runs from England all the way across Northern Europe, through France, through Germany, to Russia, and was formed by the same glaciers that helped form the Great Lakes in the United States, just on the other side of the world. Farther to the north is the Scandinavian Peninsula, where glaciers formed the famous fjords, or long, steep-sided glacial valleys now filled with seawater. They're on the Atlantic coastline. It also gave rise to the Vikings' famous slogan, "Built Fjord Tough." The Scandinavian Peninsula is separated from the rest of Europe by the Baltic Sea. To the east is Russia, where you bump into the Ural Mountains, which is the traditional division between Europe and Asia, and south of here are the Caucasus Mountains. And to the east is the Western Siberian Plain. It's kind of confusing because, if you go far enough west around the globe, sooner or later you run into the Siberian Plain, which is how they got the name the Western Siberian Plain. So don't get too confused just because it's to the east, but it's called the Western Siberian Plain. Let me tell you though, you thought driving through Indiana was boring. Try driving across 1 million square miles of flat grassland and forest. That is boring. Back to the south, mountains run through much of the interior of Europe. The Alps are Europe's most famous mountains. The Alps were formed by tectonic plates folding layers of rock upwards, and by glaciation, which is a fancy way of saying, "Them glaciers did it, yeehaw!" To the south is the Italian Peninsula, which looks like a boot about to kick Sicily over the Iberian Peninsula into the Atlantic Ocean. Italy sticks out into the Mediterranean Sea, which is without a doubt the hardest word to spell that has ever existed. To the east is the Balkan Peninsula, and eventually you get to the Black Sea, although it prefers the term African European Sea, so please show some respect. The most famous rivers of Europe are the Thames River, which is in England, the Rhine River, the Danube, and the Volga. These rivers helped European communities connect together by allowing goods and trade and ideas to flow from area to area around Europe. Much of southern Europe lies near the Mediterranean Sea, which, surprise alert, has a Mediterranean climate. Western and Central Europe, on the other hand, have a marine west coast climate because the Gulf Stream, which runs along the eastern United States, and by the time it gets to Europe, the name has changed to the North Atlantic Current, tends to keep temperatures on the continent warmer and wetter than they would be in other places of the world. Much of Eastern Europe is humid continental, and once you get to Siberia, you're in the subarctic and tundra climates. Now, for the purposes of this class, Europe is divided into 4 regions. Northern Europe, which, for the purposes of this class, includes Scandinavia and the British Isles. Western Europe, which, for the purposes of this class, includes France, Belgium, the Netherlands, also known as Holland, Austria. Then there's Southern Europe, which, for the purposes of this class, includes Spain, Portugal, and Italy. And Eastern Europe, which for the purposes of this class includes the Balkan countries, Poland, the Baltic countries, and Mother Russia! I say for the purposes of this class because people divide Europe into all sorts of different regions. These divisions are the ones we're going to use. Now, the people of Europe represent a lengthy and complicated history filled with conflict, competition, and migration. Europeans are descended from many different cultural groups, including the Swedes, Angles, Saxons, Celts, Germanic tribes, and the Slavs to the east. Europe has a high population in a pretty small area, which gives it a very high population density. And this is even shaped even more by the different geographic realities of the different places where people live. So in very concentrated small areas, the population density is even higher than places where Europeans have a little more space to spread out. Just like almost everywhere in the world, most people live along the coasts, along rivers, and in cities. The history of Europe begins once upon a time when people began moving into Europe from Central Asia. Complex civilizations began developing in the Mediterranean region. Greece and later the Roman Empire developed during the Classical period, and this period helped lay the foundation for European culture to this day. The Roman Empire grew to a size and sophistication that Europeans wouldn't regain for 1,000 years. For a century, it thrived, but eventually declined, which ushered in a period known as the Middle Ages. This period is also known as the Dark Ages, but this name doesn't really make sense because all ages were dark until the invention of electricity. Oh, that's not correct? It's because it incorrectly assumes that the people of the period were barbarians and their civilizations were completely stagnant and without culture or knowledge or economic activity? Okay, I'll make sure that I call it the Middle Ages. Thanks. During the Middle Ages, different states rose and fell from power, competing against other states for power and religious influence. Often these countries took the form of feudalism, a system in which monarchs or lords gave land to nobles in return for pledges of loyalty. The Roman Catholic Church came to dominate political and cultural life during the Middle Ages. They even sent many armies to the Middle East to liberate the Holy Land from the Muslims. This period became known as the Crusades. Yet, throughout most of the Middle Ages, Europe remained a backwater. But starting in the 1500s and then the 1600s, Europe went through a series of periods of great change that drastically altered Europe's course forever. The Reformation was a religious movement of the 1500s that lessened the power of the Roman Catholic Church and introduced Protestantism to Europe. Religious groups like Lutherans, Methodists, Calvinists, Baptists, and other Christian groups broke with the Roman Catholic Church. At the same time, the Renaissance occurred, which was a period that emphasized learning about the classical period of Greece and Rome. This was followed by the Enlightenment, a movement to value science and reason and to question traditions and the way things had always been. These periods drastically changed the direction of Europe and the world forever. Europeans took ideas and inventions from Rome, the Middle East, India, and China and used them in ways that revolutionized the world. These developments ushered in a period of exploration, conquest, and colonialism throughout the world. But back at home, the British, and later most of Europe, took part in the Industrial Revolution, which transformed manufacturing, economies, and working conditions all over Europe. People, the average everyday people, went from being dirty, poor, and exploited on a farm to being dirty, poor, and exploited in the city. The conditions of the Industrial Revolution gave rise to communism, an economic policy that called for economic equality and ownership of resources by the working classes, taken during a violent overthrow of the government. Not to be outdone by the Industrial Revolution, the French Revolution, which was a political revolution, overthrew the monarchy in France and helped spread democratic ideas all around Europe. These two events combined to help make modern Europe what it is today. Now, following these revolutions were the famous world wars of the 20th century. The wars so nice that they fought them twice. And by nice, I mean horrible. World War I started as a result of complicated alliances between different countries, hyper-nationalism, or the extreme love of one's country, and conflict over imperial colonies. The war was fought literally in the trenches, in which England, France, and Russia, and eventually the United States, defeated Germany and its allies. Then the winning side strapped Germany with rigid demands and really high fines in the peace treaty. Years later, a guy with a tiny mustache named Adolf Hitler and all of his homies rose to power to free Germany from these war demands. The war demands were called reparations. Hitler rose to power to fix the economy and bring Germany back to power. World War II broke out, and by the time it was over, 60 million people were dead, including 6 million Jews who were murdered during the Holocaust. Hashtag thanks Hitler, hashtag for nothing. The two world wars gave rise to such fun concepts as trench warfare, firebombing, genocide, atomic bombs, nuclear annihilation, flamethrowers, carpet bombing, and poison gas. It was a horrible time, but out of World War II came modern Europe, and really modern world society today. After World War II, Europe was divided by the Cold War. The Soviet Union dominated Eastern Europe and the Balkans, and the United States dominated Western Europe. This division kept much of Europe culturally and economically separated until the fall of the Iron Curtain, the nickname for the Soviet Union in 1991. Once the Soviet Union moved out of the Balkans, the area fell into a violent war that led to huge amounts of ethnic cleansing, which is basically genocide. It also led to a new term being introduced into English called Balkanization, and that is when one large country breaks up into many smaller countries, and often this is accompanied by violence. Yet, following the Cold War and this disintegration in the Balkans, much of Europe organized into a European Union, which helped to bring countries back together. This European Union was an economic and political organization whose goal was to unite Europe so that goods, services, and workers could move freely between different European nations. It's helping to bring European society closer together, but it's not without controversy. So that is a really quick introduction to Europe. We'll talk a lot more about different historical events, different elements of culture in class. But until then, thank you so much for tuning in, and have a wonderful day. Take care.